Her child wept from hunger for 5 days until a lone rancher said, "Prepare to go with me." But what happened next shocked the whole town. New Mexico Territory, October 1873. The land was dry, the nights colder than mercy, and hunger ruled like a silent enemy. Inside a broken wooden cabin, a mother named Clara held her weak child close, listening to the sound of his soft cries that had not stopped for 5 endless days. No bread, no grain, no neighbor to answer. Only the hollow wind scratching against the walls. Each sunrise felt heavier, each sunset darker, as if the world had forgotten them. Clara's heart ached with fear. Yet her spirit refused to give up, for the life of her child was the only flame left burning. In this cruel silence of the Wild West, footsteps approached, slow and steady, breaking the emptiness of the desert night. A lone rancher was coming, and his arrival would turn despair into a story that the territory would never forget. The cabin stood at the edge of the desert, its walls trembling under the weight of wind that carried dust like a curse. And inside, Clara clutched her little boy, pressing his fragile body to her chest as though her embrace alone could shield him from the hunger that gnawed at his tiny frame. His soft whimpers pierced the silence of endless nights that had stretched into 5 long days of emptiness, where not a crumb of bread remained, not a drop of milk, not even a grain forgotten in a corner jar, and her heart broke a little more each time his eyes searched hers for comfort she could not give. Yet she whispered lullabies through trembling lips to hide her despair, her voice quivering as she rocked him slowly by the weak glow of a dying lantern, whose flame flickered like their last hope. While outside the earth lay cracked and lifeless, the soil too hard to yield, the horizon empty of riders, neighbors, or mercy, and every gust against the walls reminded her of promises made by her late husband, who had fallen months before in a senseless skirmish that left her alone with a child in a world that spared no kindness. But Clara did not weep, for tears had dried long ago when she realized crying would not fill her son's stomach. So she sat stiff in the chair, her hollow eyes watching the shadows stretch across the floor, each shadow whispering of the dangers that lurked beyond the door. Raiders and drifters who would take what little they had if they came upon them. And so she prayed under her breath, her voice a faint murmur to a heaven that seemed deaf to her pleas, begging only for strength to see the boy through one more night, one more morning, one more breath. Though even she knew the body could not survive on prayer alone. And as the 5th night closed in, the sound of his cries weakened, no longer sharp but fading, a thin whisper of suffering that terrified her more than the wails, for silence meant surrender, and she pressed her lips to his damp forehead, swearing to keep him alive no matter what darkness she must face. When suddenly from the distance came a sound so foreign it startled her. The faint rhythm of hooves against dry ground, slow, deliberate, echoing closer with each passing second, and her heart raced in confusion, fear and hope colliding inside her chest. Because riders at night could mean salvation or ruin, and in this unforgiving land, strangers were often as dangerous as the hunger itself. Yet the sound grew louder until even her boy stirred weakly at the vibration. And Clara stood frozen, clutching him tightly, her bare feet rooted to the dirt floor, eyes fixed on the door as the lantern's flames swayed with the draft. And in that breathless moment, she realized her world was about to change, though she did not know whether it would be toward light or into deeper shadows. The door rattled as the knocking echoed through the frail boards, steady and strong. And Clara's breath caught in her throat, her arms tightening around her child, as if the stranger outside could feel her fear bleeding through the wood. And she stood motionless, staring at the weak lantern light that quivered with each strike, her mind torn between opening to possible salvation or keeping closed against the dangers that roamed the lawless land. Yet the sound of her boy's soft sob behind her pushed her closer to the door, step by trembling step, until she could almost feel the cold night air seeping through the cracks. Outside, Ethan stood tall beside his weary horse, dust clinging to his coat, his hat shadowing eyes that had seen too many hard roads. His hand rested not on a gun, but on the worn leather of his saddle, as though ready for either fight or mercy. His ear caught the faint cry of a child that reached him, even through the heavy silence of the desert, and his jaw tightened with resolve. For he knew hunger when he heard it. He knew despair in the pitch of a voice too small to carry weight. And though the hour was late, and strangers were seldom welcomed, something deeper than caution urged him to wait, to give one more knock. Slower this time, firm yet patient. Inside, Clara's heart raced so wildly she thought it might betray her. The memory of nights when outlaws pounded doors flashed in her mind. But the tone of this knock felt different, carrying not demand, but an echo of concern. Still her hand trembled as it reached for the latch, her lips whispering a prayer half finished. The boy shifted weakly in her arms as if sensing that the moment before them would decide whether morning would ever come. And when she finally pulled the door just enough to see, the lantern's glow spilled into the night and revealed the man standing there. His figure cut against the barren land, his face lined by years of sun and hardship, yet softened by eyes that carried neither greed nor malice, only a steady weight of purpose. And for a long second they stared at each other, two souls bound by silence, until Ethan removed his hat slowly, a gesture of respect that felt foreign in the wilderness, and his voice broke the stillness, low and rough but calm, asking if she needed help. Clara's throat tightened so hard no words came, only the sound of her child's whimper rising between them. Ethan's eyes flicked to the boy, his expression hardening not in anger, but in recognition of suffering. His stance straightened, as if fate had placed him there, not by chance, but by duty. And before Clara could decide, before she could weigh fear against trust, Ethan spoke again, his words simple yet heavy with promise, telling her he had food, telling her he had space, telling her she must prepare to go with him. Clara froze, her back pressed against the doorframe. Ethan's words lingered in the air like a promise wrapped in danger, and her boy shifted weakly in her arms, his thin face tilted toward the stranger, as though even he knew that a choice hovered between life and death. In that moment, Clara's heart thrashed inside her chest, torn between fear of betrayal and the unbearable thought of watching her child fade into silence. The weight of her husband's absence pressed against her mind, reminding her that no protector remained, no family waited. Only this lone rancher with steady eyes and a voice that carried both command and compassion. And as the wind howled across the barren land, she wondered if God himself had sent this man, or if opening her trust would deliver ruin. Yet the boy's shallow breath made the question burn sharper, leaving her no refuge in hesitation. So she searched Ethan's face, looking for a crack of deceit, but found only tired lines carved by dust and distance. And still her fingers clenched around her child, as if letting go might shatter her. Until Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper meant not to frighten, but to steady her trembling spirit, telling her again to prepare, telling her time was thin, telling her she had more to lose if she stayed than if she left. And Clara felt the world shrink to a single decision, the kind that cannot be reversed once taken. The silence between them stretched long and heavy, filled only by the boy's faint cry, until her lips parted, and she nodded almost without breath, the choice tearing through her like a blade, but also lifting a weight that had been crushing her chest for days. She gathered what little they had, a small blanket worn thin, a piece of ribbon from her husband's coat, and she wrapped her boy tighter, stepping out into the night where the lantern's glow surrendered to darkness, her bare feet meeting the cold dirt with resolve. Ethan watched without a word, only reaching for the reins of his horse, his movements careful, deliberate, as though he knew one wrong gesture might break her fragile trust. And when Clara stood beside him, the desert stretched wide, silent and merciless, but she felt the faint stir of something she had not known since her husband lived, a sliver of hope buried beneath her grief. Though fear gnawed at her with every breath, she mounted behind Ethan, clutching her child to her chest. And as the horse shifted under them, she looked back at the cabin that had been her prison, and her shelter, its roof sagging, its walls cracked, the place where her tears had fallen unseen. And she knew she was leaving behind more than wood and stone. She was leaving the life of despair. In that final glance, she whispered a farewell, then lowered her head against her boy, while Ethan urged the horse forward into the endless night. The horse carried them into the vast darkness, hooves striking the hard earth in a rhythm that echoed like a heartbeat against the silence of the desert night. And Clara held her boy so tightly against her chest she could feel the frail rise and fall of his breath beneath the thin blanket, her eyes scanning the emptiness that stretched on every side where jagged rocks cast long shadows and the barren land whispered of danger. For out here, hunger was not the only enemy. Men without conscience roamed the territory, outlaws who would take a life as quickly as a coin, and every sound carried weight. The cry of a distant coyote, the rustle of dry grass, the groan of wind curling around the ridges, all of it feeding the fear already burning in her veins. Yet Ethan's steady posture on the saddle kept her from unraveling, his hands firm on the reins, his eyes fixed ahead as though he could see a path invisible to anyone else. And though he said little, his silence carried strength, a message that he would not falter no matter how long the road stretched. But as the moon slipped behind a cloud, the darkness grew so heavy Clara felt swallowed by it. The child shifting weakly, his tiny hand clutching at her dress, and she whispered softly to calm him, though her own voice shook. While behind them, she thought she heard the faint echo of horses not their own, distant yet real, and her chest tightened at the thought that outlaws could be trailing them. Shadows hidden within shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And Ethan seemed to sense it too, for he pressed his heels gently to the horse, urging it faster, his head turning just enough to scan the ridgelines. His jaw set with quiet defiance. And Clara felt the rush of air sting her face as they rode harder, the wind pulling at her hair, the night swallowing her words. But she dared not speak for fear that even the sound of her breath might draw death closer. So she buried her face against her boy, clinging to the fragile warmth of his body, whispering a prayer that they might see dawn, while Ethan guided them through dry gullies and narrow passes where shadows twisted into shapes of men with guns, though none appeared. Yet the weight of pursuit never left them, pressing down like a storm waiting to break. And every step forward felt like defiance against a world that wanted them lost. Yet still the rancher pushed on, shoulders unyielding, gaze unbroken. And in that relentless drive, Clara found a fragment of strength she thought she had lost. For though she trembled, though fear scraped her raw, a flicker of hope sparked within her chest as the horse carried them farther from despair, deeper into the unknown night, where the line between survival and ruin thinned with every mile. The feeling didn't leave, the feeling of being watched. Every time Ethan slowed the horse to navigate a treacherous patch of rock, Clara's ears strained against the wind, listening for the telltale sound of pursuit. It wasn't just paranoia. She knew it. The feeling was too sharp, too real. And she watched Ethan. He never looked back, not fully, but his whole body was tense. He rode like a man expecting a fight, not a man on a simple errand of mercy. Who was he? Why would a simple rancher ride so deep into the Badlands at night alone? The questions coiled in her mind like rattlesnakes. He'd offered help, and she'd taken it because she had no choice. But trust was a currency she didn't have to spend. He guided the horse down a steep, narrow canyon, the walls rising up on either side, swallowing the faint moonlight. It was a perfect place for an ambush. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She tightened her grip on her son, ready to shield him with her own body. Ethan reined the horse to a sudden stop. He didn't speak. He just listened. The only sound was the wind whispering through the rocks and the heavy breathing of the horse. Clara held her breath. And then she heard it. A small scrape of a boot on gravel, high up on the canyon rim. It was faint, but unmistakable. They weren't alone. Ethan heard it too. He dismounted in one fluid motion, pulling a rifle from a scabbard on his saddle she hadn't noticed before. He pressed the reins into her hand. "Keep him quiet," he whispered, his voice a low growl that held no room for argument. "Don't move from this spot." He didn't wait for a reply. He melted into the shadows of the canyon wall, the rifle held at the ready. He moved with a predator's grace, silent and sure-footed. This was not the movement of a simple rancher. This was the movement of a hunter, or a soldier. Clara sat frozen on the horse, her child stirring against her. The silence stretched, thick and terrifying. She was alone in the dark, a helpless target, with an unknown man fighting an unseen enemy somewhere in the rocks above. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying to a god she wasn't sure was listening anymore. A sudden flash of orange lit up the canyon rim, followed by the deafening crack of a gunshot. The bullet whizzed past her head, so close she felt its heat, and slammed into the rock wall beside her. The horse panicked, rearing up on its hind legs with a terrified whinny. Clara screamed, clinging to the saddle horn with one hand and her son with the other. The horse bucked again, trying to bolt, and she lost her grip. She fell hard onto the rocky ground, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. Her son, thank God, was still clutched in her arms, his cry sharp with fear. Before she could even scramble to her feet, a dark figure was rappelling down the canyon wall on a rope, landing silently just a few yards away. Another gunshot echoed from above, but this time it was Ethan's rifle, a deeper, more powerful sound. The man in front of her grunted and staggered, but he wasn't hit. He turned, his face a mask of shadow and fury, and started toward her. Clara scrambled backward, dragging her son with her, her heart a wild drum in her ears. There was nowhere to run. The man raised his pistol, the barrel a black hole in the darkness, and pointed it straight at her child. But before he could pull the trigger, Ethan was there. He came out of the shadows like a ghost, a long knife flashing in his hand. There was no sound, only a swift, brutal movement. The attacker gasped, a choked, wet sound, and collapsed to the ground. Ethan stood over the body for a moment, his chest heaving, before turning back to her. His face was grim, his eyes hard as flint. He offered her a hand and pulled her to her feet. "We have to go," he said, his voice tight. "Now." He didn't explain who the men were. He didn't explain how he knew they were being followed. He just grabbed the horse's reins, helped her mount, and they were moving again, faster this time, leaving the dark canyon and the dead man behind them. And Clara knew, with chilling certainty, that she hadn't escaped from one kind of danger only to ride straight into another. She had been saved by a killer. As the horizon bled into pale gold, the outline of Ethan's ranch rose from the emptiness like a promise carved into the land. But it didn't look like a promise. It looked like a fortress. The fences weren't just wood. They were high and reinforced, with sharpened tops. The main house was built of thick stone, not flimsy wood, with narrow windows that looked more like slits for rifles than sources of light. Smoke lifted from a chimney, speaking of fire and food, but the sight brought Clara no comfort. It only deepened the mystery and the fear. When they crossed the main gate, which was heavy timber barred with iron, Ethan didn't just lead them to the house. He led them past it, toward a smaller, isolated cabin set back near a cluster of trees. He dismounted and reached for her boy with hands that were steady and gentle, a stark contrast to the violence she had just witnessed. He carried the child inside the small cabin. There was bread on a wooden table, and steam rose from a pot of stew on the hearth, filling the small room with warmth. It was all laid out, as if they had been expected. As her son tasted the food, a spoonful of warm broth she carefully fed him, his lips curved into the first fragile smile she had seen in days. The sight broke her resolve, and tears she thought had long dried up poured freely down her face. For a moment, just a moment, She felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it almost erased the fear. He had saved them. He had fed them. But then Ethan spoke, and the fear came rushing back. "You'll be safe here," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "Don't leave this cabin. Don't talk to anyone. Someone will bring you food twice a day. That's all you need to know." He turned to leave. "Wait," Clara said, her voice trembling but firm. "Who were those men? Why are they after us?" Ethan paused at the door, his back to her. He didn't turn around. "They weren't after you," he said, his voice low and cold. "They were after me." And with that, he was gone, the heavy cabin door closing behind him with a solid thud. The sound of a bolt sliding into place from the outside echoed in the sudden silence. She was a prisoner. She had traded a prison of starvation for a prison of stone and secrets. She rushed to the window, but it was barred. The door was locked tight. She was trapped, alone with her child in a stranger's fortress. A stranger who had enemies hunting him. A stranger who killed without hesitation. In that moment she knew the journey had not only saved them from death, but had carried them into the heart of a war she didn't understand. And hope, the fragile hope that had sparked in the desert night, was extinguished, replaced by the cold, hard certainty that the real danger had just begun. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and dread. Twice a day, a silent, grim-faced woman would unbolt the door, leave a tray of food, and leave without a word, bolting the door behind her. Clara tried to ask her questions, but the woman acted as if she couldn't hear, her eyes always fixed on the ground. Clara's boy, Samuel, began to recover. The food and warmth brought color back to his cheeks, and his cries were replaced by the soft gurgles of a healing child. But with every ounce of strength he gained, Clara's terror grew. She was fattening him up in a cage, and she didn't know who the zookeeper was, or what he wanted. She spent her time pacing the small cabin, examining every inch of it for a way out. The walls were solid stone. The bars on the window were thick iron, set deep into the frame. She was utterly trapped. At night, she'd lie awake, listening. She heard the sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the nicker of horses, the shouts of men. But they were muted, distant sounds. This cabin was deliberately isolated from the rest of the ranch. Why? What was Ethan hiding her from? Or was he hiding her for something? One afternoon, while changing Samuel's wrappings, her fingers brushed against the small, worn ribbon she had taken from her husband's coat. It was the last thing she had of his. She clutched it tightly, the frayed silk a fragile link to a life that felt a lifetime away. As she ran her thumb over it, she felt something hard and small sewn into the lining. A lump. Her heart began to pound. With trembling fingers, she worked at the threads with her teeth until they came loose. She pulled out a tiny, tightly folded piece of oilcloth. Her hands shook so badly she could barely unfold it. It wasn't a letter. It was a map. A crude, hand-drawn map of the area, but with markings she didn't understand. A series of numbers and symbols next to a landmark labeled Three Sisters Rock. And at the bottom, a single, cryptic phrase. Where the shadow falls at noon, the debt is paid. Her husband's death. It hadn't been a senseless skirmish. He wasn't just a simple farmer. He had been involved in something. Something that got him killed. Something that led these men to hunt him, and now, to hunt whoever they thought might have what he left behind. A cold dread washed over her. Ethan hadn't found her by chance. He had come to that cabin for a reason. He wasn't just a rancher caught in a feud. He knew. He must have known about her husband. Was he a partner? An enemy? Was he looking for this map? The knock on the door made her jump. It wasn't the soft tap of the woman with the food tray. It was a firm, commanding knock. It was Ethan. She quickly hid the map back in the ribbon and tucked it away. The bolt slid back, and the door opened. Ethan stood there, his face unreadable. "The boy," he said, nodding toward Samuel. He's stronger? Clara nodded, clutching Samuel tighter. Good, Ethan said, because we're leaving. Leaving? Leaving where? Clara demanded, her voice rising with panic. I'm not going anywhere with you until you tell me what's going on. Ethan stepped into the cabin, his presence filling the small space. His eyes were cold, but there was a flicker of something else in them. Impatience? Or maybe desperation. I don't have time to explain, he said. The men from the canyon, their boss is coming. His name is Silas, and he's not just coming with a few men. He's bringing an army. This ranch won't hold. Silas. The name meant nothing to her, but the way Ethan said it sent a chill down her spine. What does this have to do with me? She cried. Why am I here? Ethan finally looked her straight in the eye, and the lie fell away. His gaze was sharp, piercing. Because of your husband, he said. Because of what he stole from Silas. It was true. All of it. Her world tilted on its axis. Her husband, the kind, simple man she had loved, was a thief, and his crimes had followed her here. What did he steal? She whispered, her throat dry. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer. You tell me, he said, his voice dangerously soft. He wouldn't have left you without it. He would have made sure you had it. A map. To the Black Creek payroll. Suddenly, it all made sense. The ambush, the fortress, the prison. He hadn't rescued her. He had captured her. He wasn't her savior. He was just another vulture, circling the life her husband had destroyed. And now, the true owner was coming to collect his property, and she was standing right in the middle. I don't have it, she lied, her voice shaking but her resolve hardening. She would die before she gave this man, this killer, what he wanted. She would die before she let him use her and her son as bargaining chips. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. She met his gaze, pouring every ounce of defiance she had into her own. He was a monster, but she would not let him break her. Finally, he gave a short, humorless laugh. You're a bad liar, Clara, he said. But it doesn't matter. Silas won't ask as nicely as I am. When he gets here, he'll burn this place to the ground to get what he wants. And he'll start with this cabin. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. You have until sundown to decide, he said, his voice devoid of all warmth. You can give me the map and I can get you and the boy away from here. Or you can keep it and pray that Silas is in a merciful mood. The door slammed shut. The bolt slid home. But this time, the sound of being locked in was drowned out by the thunder of her own heart. He was giving her a choice between two devils, and the sun was already starting to sink toward the horizon. Clara paced the floor, the map a burning secret in her pocket. Ethan's words echoed in her mind. Silas is coming. She looked at Samuel, sleeping peacefully, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She had brought him out of the desert, away from starvation, only to deliver him into the hands of violent men. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on her, stealing her breath. She couldn't trust Ethan. He was a liar and a killer, after the same thing as this Silas. But his warning felt real. The memory of the fight in the canyon, the cold efficiency of his violence, told her he understood the kind of men they were facing. Could she risk her son's life on a desperate hope that Silas would be merciful? She knew the answer. She couldn't. Her husband had made his choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. Her only duty was to Samuel. She had to choose the devil she knew. As the sky outside turned a deep orange, she made her decision. She stood by the door, listening for footsteps, her hand clutching the ribbon that held her husband's damning legacy. The air grew still. The usual ranch sounds faded away into an eerie silence. It was the calm before the storm. A lifetime passed in an hour. Then she heard it. Not the sound of a single man's boots, but the sound of an army. The distant thunder of dozens of horses, growing closer, shaking the very ground beneath her feet. They were here. Panic seized her. She had waited too long. Ethan wasn't coming back for her. He had left her to her fate. She hammered on the door, screaming his name, her voice raw with terror. "Ethan, let us out! Please!" There was no answer. Only the growing roar of the approaching riders. She could hear them shouting now, their voices filled with bloodlust. She backed away from the door, pulling a heavy wooden chair against it, a futile gesture that she knew would do nothing. She scooped Samuel into her arms, retreating to the furthest corner of the cabin, making herself as small as possible. This was it. This was how it ended. The first gunshot cracked through the air, followed by a volley. The siege had begun. The cabin was her tomb. She could hear the sounds of a full-scale battle raging just outside her walls. Gunshots, splintering wood, the screams of men. She pressed herself against the cold stone, shielding Samuel with her body, whispering prayers and apologies to him, tears streaming down her face. A stray bullet slammed into the wooden door, splintering it just inches from her head. She screamed. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. The sounds were a symphony of destruction. And then, a new sound. Fire. She could hear the crackle, smell the smoke. They were burning the ranch. They were going to burn her alive. The smoke began to seep under the door, filling the small cabin with a choking haze. Samuel began to cough, his small body shaking. Desperation gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. She couldn't die like this. Not like this. She looked around the cabin, her eyes burning from the smoke, searching for anything, any hope. Her gaze fell on the hearth, the chimney. It was narrow, choked with soot, but it was a way out. It was the only way. With frantic energy, she dragged the table over to the fireplace. She climbed on top, Samuel clutched to her chest. She looked up the dark, narrow shaft. It seemed impossibly small. But it was a chance. "Hold on tight, my love," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "Hold on to Mama." She pushed him into the opening first, his small body just fitting, and then began to pull herself up after him. The brick was rough, scraping her skin raw. Her muscles screamed in protest. Soot filled her lungs, her eyes, her mouth. It was like climbing up through the throat of hell itself. But she kept going, driven by the sound of her son's frightened whimpers above her and the roar of the fire below. Inch by painful inch, she clawed her way upward, her body screaming, her mind focused on one single thought. Survive. Just as she thought her strength would give out, her hand broke through the top. She gasped, pulling in a lungful of clean, cold night air. She was out. She pulled herself onto the roof of the cabin, her body trembling with exhaustion and terror. The sight before her was apocalyptic. The main ranch house was engulfed in flames, a roaring inferno against the night sky. Men on horseback circled the blaze, firing their rifles into the burning building. Silas's army. But they weren't unopposed. From the shadows of the barns and outbuildings, flashes of gunfire answered back. Ethan and his men were still fighting, a desperate losing battle. She saw Ethan then, using a water trough for cover, firing his rifle with grim determination. He was outnumbered, outgunned. They were all going to die. She had to get away. She slid down the back of the roof, landing hard but on her feet. Keeping to the deepest shadows, she began to run, away from the fire, away from the fighting, toward the darkness of the open desert. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get Samuel away from here. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like lead. When she finally dared to look back, the ranch was a distant, fiery glow on the horizon. She had escaped. But as she stood there, catching her breath, a new horror dawned on her. the map. In the panic, in the fire, in the desperate climb up the chimney, the ribbon had come loose. It was gone. The map was back there, in the dirt, in the middle of a war zone. And she realized with a sickening lurch in her stomach that Silas wouldn't just let her go. Now, he wouldn't just be hunting for a map. He would be hunting her, believing she had it memorized. She hadn't escaped the danger. She had just become the sole target. For 2 days, she walked. The desert was a harsh, unforgiving world, and she was ill-equipped to survive it. She had no food, no water, only the clothes on her back and the child in her arms. Samuel, weakened by the smoke and the terror, grew quiet and listless. His shallow breaths were a constant, terrifying reminder of how close to the edge they were. She found a small cave in a rocky outcrop to hide from the brutal sun, her mind racing. Silas's men would be looking for her. They would be tracking her. It was only a matter of time. She was so lost in her fear that she didn't hear the footsteps until they were right outside the cave. She froze, her blood turning to ice. A shadow fell across the entrance. A man stood there, silhouetted against the bright sun. It wasn't Silas. It was Ethan. He looked like he'd been through a war. His face was smeared with soot, his clothes were torn, and a bloody bandage was wrapped around his left arm. But he was alive. He looked at her, then at Samuel, his expression unreadable. Clara scrambled back, pulling her son protectively to her chest. "Stay away from me," she hissed, her voice a dry rasp. "You left us there to die." "I didn't have a choice," Ethan said, his voice weary. "I had to draw their fire. If they knew you were in that cabin, they would have taken you first. It was the only way to give you a chance to escape." He took a step into the cave, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you, Clara. I'm here to help you." "Help me?" She scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You wanted the map. That's all you ever wanted." "Yes," he admitted, his honesty surprising her. "I wanted the map, but not for the money." He sat down heavily on a rock near the entrance, his whole body slumping with exhaustion. "Silas, he's not just an outlaw, Clara. The money from that payroll will buy him enough guns and enough men to take over this entire territory. He'll bleed it dry. Judges, sheriffs. He'll own them all. Your husband, James, he was part of Silas's gang. But he got scared. He saw what Silas was becoming, and he wanted out. Stealing that map was his only way." This was a different story. A different James. Not just a thief, but a man who tried to do the right thing in the end. "James and I," Ethan continued, his voice low. "We grew up together. We were like brothers. When he got in with Silas, I tried to warn him. He wouldn't listen. When he contacted me a month ago, told me what he'd done and what he planned to do, I tried to help him. I was supposed to meet him. But Silas got to him first." Ethan looked up, and for the first time, Clara saw not a killer, not a captor, but a man drowning in grief. "I wasn't looking for the map for myself, Clara. I was looking for it to finish what your husband started, to stop Silas." A fragile seed of trust began to sprout in the barren soil of her fear. Could he be telling the truth? Before she could process it all, Ethan's head snapped up. He was listening intently. "What is it?" she whispered. "Riders," he said, his voice dropping to a tense whisper. "At least 5 of them. They're close." He scrambled to his feet, pulling his pistol. "They've found us!" He peered out of the cave entrance. "They're spreading out. They'll have this cave surrounded in minutes. There's no way to fight our way out." Despair, cold and familiar, washed over Clara once more. This was it. There was no escape. But Ethan wasn't looking defeated. He was looking at the back of the cave. "There," he said, pointing to a narrow fissure in the rock, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "It might lead somewhere. It's our only chance." He looked back at her, his eyes full of a desperate urgency. "Give me the boy," he said. "I'll go first. I can pull him through behind me. You follow." Without a second thought, she handed Samuel to him. Her distrust, her anger, it all evaporated in the face of their shared, immediate peril. All that mattered was survival. Ethan disappeared into the crack in the rock, his movements surprisingly agile for a man his size. A moment later, his hand reappeared. "Okay," he called out, his voice muffled. "Send him through." She gently guided Samuel into the tight space. It was a terrifying leap of faith, pushing her child into the dark unknown, into the arms of a man she barely knew. But the shouts of Silas's men outside were getting louder. She had no choice. She squeezed into the fissure after them, the rock scraping against her hips and shoulders. It was a tight, suffocating darkness. She could hear Ethan's steady breathing ahead, and Samuel's soft whimpers. It felt like being buried alive. After what seemed like an eternity of shuffling and scraping through the rock, she saw a faint light ahead. They emerged into another, smaller cave, this one with an opening high up on a cliff face, overlooking a deep ravine. They were hidden. For now. Below, they could see Silas's men swarming the area, their figures small like ants. One of them found the first cave. He shouted, and the others converged on the spot. They had escaped, but just barely. Ethan sank to the ground, cradling the sleeping Samuel in his good arm. He looked at Clara, his face grim. "He won't give up," Ethan said. "As long as he thinks you have that map, he will hunt you to the ends of the earth." Clara's hand went to her pocket, where the ribbon should have been. Her heart sank. "It's gone," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The map. I lost it, back at the ranch, during the fire." Ethan stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and despair. All of it, the fight, the deaths, the destruction of his home, had been for nothing. The one piece of evidence that could bring Silas down was gone, likely burned to ash or lost in the dirt. But then, a strange look crossed his face. Not despair, but calculation. An idea was forming behind his eyes. "You lost it," he said slowly, testing the words. "But Silas doesn't know that." A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. "In fact," he said, looking at her with a newfound respect, "I think we can use that." Clara didn't understand. What could they do? They had nothing. "He's hunting you," Ethan explained, his voice gaining strength. "He wants the map, so we're going to give him one." He wasn't talking about finding the map. He was talking about creating a trap, and she was going to be the bait. "It's too dangerous," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. The thought of facing Silas, of deliberately walking into his path, was terrifying. "It's the only way," Ethan countered, his voice firm. "We can't outrun him forever, not with the boy. Our only chance is to choose the battlefield, to draw him in on our terms." He explained the plan. There was an old abandoned silver mine a day's ride from here, a maze of tunnels and shafts carved into a mountain. It was a death trap for anyone who didn't know the layout. And Ethan knew it like the back of his hand. They would lead Silas there. They would leak false information through a contact Ethan had in the nearest town, a whisper that Clara was heading to the mine to meet a buyer for the map. Silas, consumed by greed, would take the bait. "He'll come himself," Ethan said with certainty. "He won't trust anyone else with this. He'll bring his best men, but he'll be so focused on the prize that he'll walk right into our trap." Clara looked at Samuel, sleeping in the crook of Ethan's arm, oblivious to the life and death decision being made for him. She thought of her husband, James, who had died trying to escape this man. She thought of the fear she had lived with for months, the hunger, the running. She was tired of running. "Okay," she said, her voice steady now, filled with a cold resolve she didn't know she had. "I'll do it." Ethan nodded, a look of grim approval in his eyes. He tore a strip of cloth from his ruined shirt. He handed it to her, along with a piece of charcoal from a long-dead fire. "We need something for you to sell," he said. "Make it look convincing." For the next hour, she worked, copying the symbols and lines she remembered from her husband's map onto the new piece of cloth. Her hand didn't tremble. Her mind was clear. She wasn't just recreating a map. She was writing Silas's death warrant. When she was done, they began the journey. Ethan knew the land, guiding them through hidden trails and canyons that kept them out of sight. They shared the last of their water in the silence of two people bound by a desperate purpose. The next evening, they arrived at the edge of the mining town, a dusty collection of saloons and run-down shacks. Ethan found a young boy and gave him a silver coin. "Take this message to the bartender at the Lucky Ace," he instructed. "Tell him a woman with a child passed through, heading for the old Diablo mine. Tell him she was asking about the noon shadow." It was the phrase from the map. The bait was set. They didn't wait to see if the message was delivered. They rode hard for the mountains, arriving at the abandoned mine as the moon climbed high in the sky. The entrance was a dark, gaping maw in the side of the mountain, a gateway to the underworld. Ethan found a secure, hidden chamber deep inside the mine for her and Samuel. He gave her a pistol and an extra box of cartridges. "Stay here," he said. "No matter what you hear, do not come out. I'll come back for you." He looked at her then, his gaze lingering. "Your husband would be proud of you," he said softly. And then he turned and disappeared into the labyrinth of tunnels, a ghost preparing for war. Clara was alone again, in the crushing darkness deep within the earth, her son sleeping at her side, the fake map clutched in her hand. All she could do now was wait for the devil to come calling. The wait was agonizing. Every drip of water, every skittering rat, sounded like approaching footsteps. Hours crawled by. Samuel stirred, and she nursed him in the dark, her body tense, her ears straining for any sound from the world above. Then, she heard it. The distant sound of horses just as before. But this time she felt no fear, only a cold, hard knot of anticipation in her stomach. She heard voices, rough and commanding. Silas had arrived. She could hear them entering the main tunnel, their boots crunching on the loose gravel. She heard Silas's voice, loud and arrogant, echoing off the rock walls. "Spread out! Find her! I want that map, and I want her alive!" The hunt had begun. For the next hour, the mine was filled with the sounds of Silas's men searching, their voices and the beams of their lanterns cutting through the darkness. Clara stayed perfectly still, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She held the pistol in her hand, the cold metal a small comfort in the terrifying dark. Suddenly, a single gunshot roared through the tunnels, deafeningly loud, followed by a man's scream that was cut short. Then another shot, and another. Ethan had begun his work. The sounds of the hunt changed. The confident shouts of Silas's men were replaced by cries of confusion and fear. They were being picked off, one by an unseen enemy in the darkness they couldn't comprehend. "He's in the walls!" one man screamed. "It's a ghost!" Another fired his gun wildly into the darkness, the bullets ricocheting off the rocks with dangerous whines. The maze of tunnels that was supposed to be their hunting ground had become their tomb. Ethan was using his knowledge of the mine perfectly, appearing and disappearing, striking from the shadows, turning their own numbers and panic against them. The battle was brutal and short. The gunshots grew more sporadic, the screams faded, until at last, an eerie silence fell over the mine once more. It was over. But then she heard one last set of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming straight toward her hiding place. Her blood ran cold. Had one of Silas's men found her? Or was it Silas himself? She raised the pistol, her hands trembling, and pointed it at the entrance to the chamber. The footsteps stopped right outside. "Clara!" a voice called out. It was Silas. His voice was smooth, almost pleasant, but it dripped with menace. "I know you're in there. Your little protector put up a good fight, but he's gone. It's just you and me now." Her heart sank. Ethan. He had failed. He was dead. "Give me the map, Clara," Silas continued, his voice calm and reasonable. "Give it to me, and I'll let you and the boy walk out of here. You have my word." She knew it was a lie. She had seen what his men did. She knew there was no mercy in this man. She was trapped, but she would not be taken easily. "Go to hell," she called out, her voice shaking but full of defiance. She heard him laugh, a low, cruel sound. "Have it your way." She heard a scraping sound, and then smelled the unmistakable scent of oil. He was going to burn her out. Just like at the ranch. Panic began to set in, but she fought it down. Ethan had told her not to leave. He had promised he would come back. She had to trust him. The light of a torch appeared at the entrance. Silas stood there, a sneer on his face. He held the torch high, ready to set fire to the wooden support beams. "Last chance, Clara," he snarled, but before he could move, a voice came from the darkness behind him. "Drop it, Silas!" Ethan. He wasn't dead. He stepped out of a side tunnel, his rifle leveled at Silas's chest. He was wounded, bleeding from a cut on his head, but he was standing. Relief washed over Clara so powerfully she almost collapsed. Silas spun around, his eyes wide with shock. "You," he whispered. "You should be dead." "Not yet," Ethan said, his voice cold as ice. "It's over, Silas. Your men are gone." Silas laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. "It's never over!" he screamed, and instead of dropping the torch, he lunged at Ethan. The two men crashed together in a brutal, desperate fight. The torch fell to the ground, casting wild, dancing shadows on the walls. Clara could only watch in horror as they wrestled in the narrow tunnel, their grunts and the thud of their blows echoing in the confined space. Silas was bigger, stronger, but Ethan was faster, fueled by years of rage. Silas managed to grab a loose rock and brought it down on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan cried out in pain and staggered back. Silas saw his opening and dove for the fallen torch, intending to finish it all. But Clara acted. She didn't think. She just moved. She burst out of the chamber, raising the pistol she still held. Silas was fumbling with the torch, his back to her. "For James!" she screamed, and she pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening in the tunnel. Silas stiffened, a look of utter surprise on his face. He turned slowly, stared at her, and then collapsed to the ground, the torch rolling from his lifeless fingers and extinguishing itself in the dust. Silence. The battle was finally truly over. Clara stood trembling, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Ethan limped over to her, his face a mask of pain and exhaustion. He looked from her to the body of Silas, and then back again. He reached out and gently took the pistol from her shaking hand. "It's done," he whispered. "It's really done." They walked out of the mine and into the clean air of the dawn. The world seemed quiet, peaceful, as if it was breathing a sigh of relief. They had survived. The story of what happened at the Diablo mine spread like wildfire. When Ethan and Clara rode back into town, they weren't met with suspicion, but with awe. The people who had lived in fear of Silas and his gang for years saw them as heroes. The territorial marshal arrived, and Ethan told him everything, handing over evidence he had collected for years that would put the rest of Silas's corrupt network away for good. It turned out Ethan wasn't just a rancher. He was a former U.S. Marshal who had quit the service after his family was killed by outlaws, dedicating his life to protecting the innocent who lived outside the reach of the law. His ranch was a sanctuary, a place for people like Clara, people running from a world that had wronged them. With Silas gone, a fragile peace settled over the territory. Clara and Samuel stayed at the ranch, which the community helped Ethan rebuild. It was no longer a fortress, but a home. The high fences came down, and the barred windows were replaced. The silence of fear was replaced by the sounds of life, of laughter, of a future being built from the ashes of the past. Clara found a peace she never thought she would know again. She had faced the worst of the world, and had not only survived but had found her own strength. She had watched her son's cries of hunger turn into shouts of joy as he played under the wide-open sky. The lone rancher hadn't just saved them from starvation, he had given them a new life. And in the heart of the unforgiving West, two broken families, brought together by violence and loss, had found a way to become whole again. The town never forgot the story of the starving mother and the silent rancher, a story that proved that even in the darkest of nights, hope can arrive on a tired horse, and courage can be found in the most unexpected of places. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the shadows of history.